The New Mexico Territory, 1881. Mesilla Crossing huddled under a persistent, gritty mist that was too fine to be called rain and too cold to be ignored. It was a place that felt temporary, a scar of mud and slapped-together lumber between the desert and the river. The dull clang of the mission church bell, calling for an evening service no one would attend, was cut apart by the rhythmic, angry strike of a hammer on steel from the smithy. Further off, a train whistle cried out, a lonely, metallic sound that promised escape but never seemed to get any closer. The air smelled of wet adobe, sulfur from the coal smoke, and the sharp, ferrous tang of rust. Inside the long, low warehouse belonging to Ferris Pike, the air was different. It was thick with the acidic bite of indigo dye, a deep, bruising blue that stained the walls and the floor. In the back, shielded from the street by towering bolts of canvas and wool, Tamsin Vale lay on a pile of discarded burlap. She was 19 years old. The waves of childbirth had crested and broken just minutes before. A silent, brutal storm, a filthy rag, tasting of sweat and tobacco, was tied tight across her mouth, muffling the agony. Her wrists were raw, the skin rubbed down to bleeding pulp by the sisal rope that bound them to a wooden support beam. The umbilical cord, a pale, useless question mark, still connected her to the small, squirming life beside her. Beyond the partition of stacked crates, men gathered. Their voices were low, the sound of commerce in a place that respectable commerce had abandoned. Lamplight cut yellow, smoking holes in the gloom, glinting off the coins and silver pieces trading hands. A match flared, briefly illuminating a face pock-scarred and grinning, before settling on the end of a cigar. There were crumpled receipts for debt, IOUs for poker games, and laid out with reverence on Pike's sorting table. A single sheet of paper. It was an indenture contract, the letterhead official, the ink still fresh, bearing the forged, looping signature of a traveling circuit judge. The child, a girl, let out a thin, mewling cry. One of Pike's men, a lanky youth named Dorn with a silver scar pulling at his lip, laughed. He scooped the infant up, careless of the new life, and wrapped it in an empty cornmeal sack. He carried the bundle to the large brass scales used for weighing bolts of cloth and sacks of grain. He set the child on the pan, and it tipped heavily. Weighs more than she's worth in feed, Dorn announced, and the men chuckled. Ferris Pike, a man whose tailored waistcoat strained against a prosperous belly, stroked his graying beard. He looked at Tamsin, still straining against the ropes, her body trembling with aftershocks, and then at the men. The contract is for the woman, Pike said, his voice oiled and smooth. A good, strong back for field or housework, 19 years, unbroken. He paused, gesturing with a clean, manicured finger toward the scales. But tonight, gentlemen, a special consideration. She comes with the issue, freshly birthed. The laughter that followed was sharp and ugly. Men nudged each other. It was a fine joke. They were not just buying labor. They were buying a set. A figure had been standing at the open rear door of the warehouse for some time, a silhouette against the graying mist. The men, focused on their transaction, had not noticed him. He was tall, built of long muscle and bone, and wore a canvas duster soaked dark with the endless drizzle. Water dripped from the brim of his hat. When he stepped forward, the sound of his boot heel on the wooden planks was definitive. The laughter guttered out. He was Elias Rourke, a horseman who kept a way station at Sage Draw, a man who spoke little and whose eyes, when he raised them, were the color of a river in a long drought. He moved past the watchers, his gaze not on them, but on the child on the scales and the woman on the floor. He ignored Pike, walking directly to the rough-hewn barrel that served as the auction block. The men tensed, hands drifting to the pistols at their hips. Rourke did not seem to notice. He reached into the deep pocket of his duster and pulled out a canvas pouch. He did not count the coins. He simply upended it, and a heavy cascade of silver and some gold eagles, all tarnished and damp with rain, spilled onto the wood. It was a messy, indifferent pile of wealth. $240, Elias Rourke said. His voice was a low rasp, like dry leaves skittering over stone. He finally looked at Ferris Pike. "I am not buying a person. I am buying an end to this." Ferris Pike's smooth expression tightened. This was not the protocol. This was an interruption. "Sir, this is a private arrangement. The bidding has requirements." "It is," Elias agreed, his voice flat. "And I am ending it." "Now see here." Pike bristled, stepping forward. "You can't just—" Silas Dorn, the man with the scar, moved to intercept, his hand closing around the grip of his revolver. "The boss is talking." "Stranger." Elias did not move his hands toward his own hip. Instead, he slowly, almost casually, pushed back the left side of his wet duster. Pinned to the rough wool of his vest was a bronze star, old and worn, the lettering faint. It marked him as a former deputy marshal, a man who had once carried the weight of the federal government on his chest. Beside it, tucked into his waistband, was the butt of a Colt revolver. The walnut grip was worn smooth, the bluing rubbed away from the holster, a testament to long, hard use. He did not draw it. He did not touch it. He simply let them see it. He let them understand that he was not a customer. He was a reckoning. The men in the room shifted. They were opportunists, not soldiers. They traded in misery, but they were not keen to die for it. The tarnished star meant paperwork, and the worn gun meant speed. Pike stared at the star, then at the money, then at the unblinking, quiet eyes of Elias Rourke. He swallowed. He hated this. It was bad for business. But the $240 was more than he had expected to get in a night of haggling. He gave a sharp, reluctant nod to one of his men, who banged a small mallet on the table. The sound was flat, final. The deal was done. Elias Rourke turned his back on them all. He walked to Tamsin, who had watched the entire exchange with wide, vacant eyes, the gag still choking her. He pulled a heavy hunting knife from the sheath on his belt. She flinched, a small animal sound escaping the gag. He did not speak. He simply knelt and, with two precise, upward slashes, cut the sisal ropes at her wrists. He put the knife away. He did not help her up. He walked to the scales, pushed aside the cornmeal sack, and lifted the crying infant. He held the child for a moment, his large, rough hands looking awkward and oversized, before turning back to Tamsin. She was pushing herself up on one elbow, her body screaming in protest, blood and sweat and the blue dye of the warehouse streaking her skin. Elias knelt again, his knees cracking. He carefully, deliberately, placed the warm, damp bundle into the crook of her arm, folding her limp hand around it. "Hold your baby," he commanded, his voice low but insistent. "We're leaving this place." Tamsin's fingers spasmed, then tightened. The grip was fierce, a sudden, desperate claiming. The emptiness in her eyes was replaced by a pinprick of burning light. She held the child to her chest, pulling herself to her feet using the support beam. She swayed, the world tilting. Elias Rourke stood. He put a hand out, not to touch her, but to steady her elbow as she threatened to fall. It was the briefest contact, impersonal, practical. He walked her toward the rear door, a shield between her and the silent, glowering men they left behind. Pike was already counting the money, his anger fading into avarice. Tamsin Vale stepped out of the indigo-stained darkness and into the cold, gray mist of Mesilla Crossing. She stumbled on the uneven mud of the alley, her legs shaking, a fresh wave of pain making her gasp. Elias's hand was there again, bracing her, then gone as soon as she found her footing. He did not speak. He did not offer comfort. He just walked beside her, a tall, silent guardian, as she staggered through the wet, clinging dark, her eyes as black and empty as a desert night, her hands locked tight around the only thing in the world that was hers. The ride to Sage Draw was less than 3 miles, but it felt like a journey across an entire lifetime. The mist had thickened, turning the world into a gray, featureless purgatory. Elias had hoisted Tamsin onto his horse, a big, steady mare that seemed unfazed by the storm or the trembling woman on its back. He walked beside her, one hand on the bridle, his duster shedding water like a canvas roof. Tamsin held the infant inside her torn dress, shielding it with her own body, her teeth chattering so hard she thought they might break. Every jolt of the horse's gait sent a fresh, sharp lance of pain through her lower body. She focused on the steady clump of Elias Rourke's boots in the mud. He did not speak, not once. He offered no false comfort, no questions. He was simply a presence, a bulwark against the wind. His silence as vast and enveloping as the landscape itself. Sage Draw was not a town, or even a homestead. It was a scar of function carved into a low canyon, a long, sturdy-looking horse corral, a small barn, and the cabin. The cabin was built low to the ground, its walls made of thick, chinked logs and its roof of sod, mosses, and wild grasses growing right out of it. It looked more like a feature of the earth than a building set upon it. Smoke plumed from a stone chimney, a flat, gray ribbon that was immediately torn apart by the wind. Elias led the horse under a small lean-to, its roof rattling under the drizzle. He put his hands up to Tamsin's waist. "Easy," he said. It was the first word in an hour. His lift was strong, impersonal, and set her on her feet. Her legs instantly buckled. He caught her before she hit the ground, his arm locking around her ribs, and half lifted, half dragged her the remaining few feet to the cabin door. He kicked it open, and a wave of impossible warmth washed over them. The inside was one room, but it was clean, and it was tight against the wind. The silence was profound. The howling gale outside was reduced to a muted whistle at the chimney. A large cast-iron stove in the corner radiated a deep, penetrating heat. The air smelled of burning cedar, old leather, and faintly of baking. A half-risen loaf of cornbread sat on a wooden board near the stove, forgotten. A heavy trestle table dominated the center of the room. A cot was built into one wall, covered in thick wool blankets. Tools hung in neat, orderly rows on the wall awls, leather punches, knives, and harnesses. It was the space of a man who lived by his hands, a space where every object had a purpose. Elias guided her to a single straight-backed chair by the fire and eased her into it. She sank down, her whole body shaking in the sudden heat. The baby, startled by the warmth and the light, began to cry in earnest. A thin, desperate wail. Tamsin fumbled with the rags, her fingers numb and clumsy. She looked at the child, truly looked at it for the first time. It was red, smeared with blood and birthing fluid. Its face crumpled, and it was still attached to her. Elias did not seem to notice her distress. He moved with a quiet, relentless economy. He stoked the fire, adding 2 more logs of cedar until it roared. He swung a heavy iron pot onto the stove hook and began ladling water into it from a bucket by the door. He turned to her, his gaze practical. "The water will be hot soon. We need to cut the cord." Tamsin just stared, clutching the child. He pulled his skinning knife from his belt, the same one he had used on her ropes. He took a bottle of whiskey from a high shelf and poured a generous amount over the blade, the alcohol hissing as it hit the steel. He set the knife on the table. He took a length of clean sinew from a hook. Then he went to a small, dark-stained chest at the foot of his cot. He paused, his back to her. When he turned around, he held a small, neatly folded piece of pale linen. It was a diaper, yellowed with age, but clean. In the corner, embroidered with fine, faded blue thread, were 2 letters A.R. "My mother's," he said, his voice quiet, answering the question she had not asked. "She kept a few things. From my older brother. He did not live past his first winter." He placed the cloth on the table next to the knife with an awkward reverence, as if the small piece of fabric held more weight than all the tools on his wall. "There is a basin behind that screen," he said, nodding to a folding partition in the corner. "More hot water in the kettle, soap, clean cloths. You can wash. You can rest. The cot is yours." He pointed to a small bottle of dark, viscous liquid on the shelf. "A friend, a Navajo man, gave me this. He calls it stone blood. It is for pain, and to stop bleeding. Take some when you are clean." He had given her all the tools. He had not offered to do it for her. He was giving her the dignity of tending to herself and her child. He took his duster from his shoulders, the garment heavy and dripping, and hung it by the door. He took the half-baked cornbread and, oddly, placed it outside the door on the porch. Then he picked up a rifle from the corner, checked its action, and walked back out into the mist, closing the door firmly behind him, leaving her alone in the sudden, shocking quiet. Tamsin sat frozen for a full minute, listening. There was only the sound of the fire and the bubbling pot. He was gone. A violent shiver broke her paralysis. She worked with a frantic, desperate energy. She laid the infant on the warm blankets of the cot. She took the sinew and tied it tight around the cord, as she had seen a ranch wife do once with a lamb. She took his sterilized knife, its edge wickedly sharp, and she cut. A final, physical separation. The baby's cry spiked, then settled. She took the basin, the soap, the cloths, and the kettle of hot water behind the screen. The hot water on her skin was a pain so exquisite it was almost pleasure. She washed the filth of the warehouse, the sweat of labor, and the blood of birth from her body. Her hands shook, but she was thorough. She used the dark liquid, the stone blood, and found the bleeding easing, the sharpest edges of the pain dulling to a deep, heavy ache. She cleaned the child last, her touch hesitant, then firmer. She wrapped the baby in the linen diaper. The AR was soft against the new skin. Finally, exhausted, she pulled back the wool blankets on the cot, climbed in, and pulled the child to her chest. The baby's head turned, mouth open, rooting instinctively. Tamsin gasped as the child latched on, a sharp, surprising sting that quickly faded into a strange, pulling relief. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her stomach. The pain was a heavy tide, but holding the warm, nursing child. Another feeling rose up, a fierce, terrifying sense of possession. This was hers. She did not know how long she lay there, drifting between waking and exhaustion. Before the door opened again, Elias Rourke came back in, carrying an armload of firewood. He did not look at her, giving her the courtesy of her privacy on the cot. He stacked the wood neatly. He saw the bloodied knife on the table, the basin of stained water, the cornmeal sack on the floor. He picked them all up. He took the basin outside, emptied it, and returned. He cleaned the knife with an oiled rag until it shone. He had brought the cornbread back in. It was no longer half-baked. It was covered in fresh mud and what looked like boot prints. He threw the ruined loaf into the fire, where it hissed and smoked. He had used it to mask their tracks. He moved to the stove and began to make coffee, the smell of it rich and dark. He poured 2 cups into tin mugs. He brought one over, setting it on the small crate beside the cot. He still did not look at her directly, his gaze fixed on the wall above her head. Tamsin pulled the blanket higher. Her voice was a dry croak. "What do you want in return?" The question hung in the warm air, sharp and cold as the knife he had just cleaned. It was the only question she knew. Everything had a price. Freedom, safety, a cup of coffee. She braced herself for the answer. A week of work, her body, her child. Elias stopped. He turned slowly and finally, truly, looked at her. His eyes were not cold, she realized. They were just still. They were the color of wet slate, and they held an ancient, banked anger. He looked at her, then at the baby sleeping at her breast, then back to her. "You want your name back?" he said. It was not a question. "That indenture paper is ash. You are not property. You are just a woman who needed out of a bad place." He turned his gaze to the fire, the muscles in his jaw working. "And he said, his voice dropping so low she had to strain to hear it over the wind. "I want to stop them." His eyes met hers again, and she saw it. Not desire, not pity. She saw smoldering embers. She saw a man who had seen this before and had drawn a line in the dirt. He was not her savior. He was her ally. "Get some sleep," he said, his voice returning to its flat, practical tone. "You are safe here tonight." He took his own mug of coffee and his rifle and walked to the door. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice small. "Porch. I like the air." He left. Night fell hard. The wind rose to a scream, rattling the one small window pane. Tamsin lay in the dark, her body aching. But the warmth of the stove and the weight of the child kept the worst of the cold at bay. She listened to the storm. She listened to the breathing of her daughter. But she was not a fool. Safety was a word. Nothing more. He said he wanted to stop them. What if he was one of them? What if this was just a different kind of cage? A softer one. The survival instinct, the one that had kept her alive in Pike's service for 2 years, was screaming. She slipped out of the cot, the movement agonizing. The baby did not stir. She padded, barefoot, to the dry sink where he had laid out the kitchen knives. She took the smallest one, a thin-bladed paring knife, its wooden handle worn smooth. She went back to the bed. Her first instinct was to hide it under the straw-filled mattress, within easy reach. She lifted the mattress, ticking, her hand trembling. She stopped. She looked at the closed door. Outside, on the porch, in the freezing wind, sat the man who had paid $240 just to end it. The man who had given her his mother's linen. The man who was sleeping on a wooden bench so she could have a bed. Her hand, still holding the knife, was shaking for a different reason. She let the mattress fall. She knelt, the floorboards cold against her knees. She found a gap where one of the planks had warped, a dark, narrow space between the wood and the stone foundation. She slipped the knife into the gap, pushing it deep until the handle was out of sight but still within reach of her fingers. Her hand was still trembling, but the decision was made. It was not trust, not yet. It was a compromise. She would not sleep unarmed, but she would not sleep with a weapon pointed at the man who had, for the first time in her life, treated her like a human being. Outside, on the wooden bench, Elias Rourke pulled his duster tighter. He did not sleep. He sat with his back against the cabin wall, his rifle across his knees, his hat pulled low. He listened to the wind as it shrieked over the draw, and he listened to the small, furtive sounds from inside the cabin, the creak of the cot, the soft pad of bare feet, the slide of wood against wood. He heard her vigilance, and in the darkness, he guarded it. Dawn did not break, it seeped. A thin, pearly light leaked over the canyon rim, illuminating the steam rising from the damp, frosted grass. Inside the cabin, the fire in the stove had burned down to glowing coals, and the air was cold. Tamsin woke with a sharp intake of breath, the pain a sudden, insistent reminder. For a disorienting moment, she was back in the indigo-scented darkness of the warehouse. Then she felt the small, warm weight on her chest and smelled the cedar smoke. She was at Sage Draw. She was, for the moment, safe. The child stirred, its tiny, perfect mouth working in its sleep. It was a girl. Tamsin had known it, felt it. She brushed a finger over the baby's fine, dark hair, a tentative, exploring touch. All her life, Tamsin had owned nothing, not even her own skin. Now, this. She whispered a name into the cold morning air, a name she had hoarded in her mind like a secret coin, a name she had once dreamed of giving a daughter, if she had ever been free. Keegan. The name felt strange and solid on her tongue. It was an act of claiming, and it terrified her. Claiming things meant they could be taken. She eased herself off the cot, her body stiff and sore, but the bleeding had slowed. The Navajo medicine had worked. She moved quietly, settling Keegan into the nest of blankets. She looked around the small, masculine room. Elias Rourke was nowhere to be seen. His duster was gone from the hook. Her eyes landed on the door. Beyond it was the world. Beyond it was Ferris Pike and Silas Dorn, and the forged indenture paper that might as well be a death warrant. Pike was not a man to lose an investment, even one he had been paid for. He would see Rourke's intervention as an insult. He would come looking. She had brought a storm to this man's doorstep. Her decision was instant, a reflex honed by years of survival. She had to leave. She had nothing to pack. She wore a simple wool shirt and canvas pants Elias had left on the chest, clothes that must have belonged to a smaller man or a boy. They were clean. She retied her hair with a scrap of leather. She looked at the paring knife, still hidden in the floorboards. She left it. It was his. She wrapped Keegan tightly in another wool blanket, the baby murmuring in protest at the cold air. Tamsin took a deep breath, steeling herself for the walk. She did not know where she would go. West, maybe, into the desert, anywhere but Massilia. She opened the door. Elias was in the corral, not 50 feet away, his back to her. He was hammering a new rail into place, the sound a sharp, clean thwack that echoed in the cold air. He did not turn around, but he spoke, his voice carrying easily. "You are leaving because you want to, or because you are being chased." It was not a question. Tamsin froze, her hand on the door frame. "It does not matter," she said, her voice tight. "I am leaving." "I think it does matter." He still had not turned. He set another nail and drove it home with 2 perfect, efficient strikes. Pike's men will be watching the roads. They will be watching the train depot. They will not be watching my corral. You do not know that. You do not know him. I know his kind. He finally turned, his face unreadable in the flat light. "Do not let fear be your guide. Tamsin, it will always lead you back into a cage." A bitter laugh escaped her, sharp as chipped flint. "Fear," she said, stepping onto the porch, "is what kept me alive this long." She held Keegan closer. "Fear told me to run when I was 14. Fear told me to be quiet in that warehouse. Fear is the only guide I have ever had." Elias walked slowly toward her, wiping his hands on a rag. He stopped at the foot of the porch, looking up. His gaze was steady. Not judging, just watching. "Then it is time for a new one. Courage will let you live." "Courage gets you killed," she snapped. "Sometimes," he agreed, with a small nod. "But living in fear is not living at all. It is just waiting." She stared at him, her body vibrating with the need to run, her mind screaming at the logic of his words. She was trapped. "What do you want?" she asked again, the words raw. "I have a corral to mend before the next string of government horses comes through. That is 2 weeks' work. I am one man, and I am behind. The stove needs tending. Meals need cooking. I'm a bad cook." He gestured to the cabin. "You need a place to heal. The baby needs a place to be warm." He was offering a trade. Not a purchase. A trade. 2 weeks, he said. "You heal. You help with the cooking. Tend your child. I mend the fence. No strings. No questions I do not need to ask." He paused. "After 2 weeks, you will be stronger. The mare in the barn will be yours, and I will draw you a map through the high passes, where Pike will never look." It was the most freedom she had ever been offered. A choice, a timeline, a horse. All right, she whispered. 2 weeks, then I'm gone." "Fair enough," he said, and turned back to the corral, as if the transaction was of no more consequence than mending the rail. The silence of the next few days was a living thing. It was not empty. It was filled with observation. They circled each other like 2 wary animals, learning by watching. Tamsin learned that Elias Rourke lived by a silent, rigid clock. He was up before dawn, tending the horses. He worked with a deep, methodical patience. She watched him from the cabin window as she nursed Keegan. He was reshoeing the mare he had promised her, and his hands, which she knew to be strong, were impossibly gentle. He held the horse's hoof between his knees, his movements economical, his voice a low, steady murmur to the animal. He worked the forge, and the hammer blows were a rhythmic heartbeat for the small canyon. He was a man steady as a vice, a man who built and mended. From the corral, Elias watched her. He saw her sweep the porch, her movement stiff with pain, but resolute. He saw her organize his messy pantry, her hands quick and sure. She took a spool of his heavy waxed thread and a sail needle and meticulously mended the tear in her own worn dress. She tied things. She tied back the canvas flap over the woodpile with a knot he recognized, a taut-line hitch. Neat as script, a knot that holds under pressure but can be easily adjusted. She was capable. She was a survivor. But he also saw the way she watched the canyon rim, her body tensing at the sound of a distant rockfall, and the way she held Keegan, with a kind of desperate, protective fragility. They ate their meals in the same quiet. "Coffee's hot," she would say. "Stew's ready." "Thank you," he would reply. "The wood is stacked." It was a language of tasks. It was safe. On the 5th day, the rhythm broke. The sun was high, beating down with a dry, relentless heat. Tamsin was outside, hanging washed diapers on a line Elias had strung. Keegan sleeping in a basket at her feet. She saw the dust first. Just a small puff, far down the draw. Her heart seized. Elias came out of the barn, his rifle in his hand, his body instantly alert. They stood together, watching. It was not riders. It was a single, small figure, stumbling, walking with the uneven, determined gait of a child. The figure walked out of the heat haze. A little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old. She was wearing a tattered dress meant for a child twice her size, her feet bare, her hair a matted tangle of pale blonde. She walked right up to the porch, stopped in front of Tamsin, and just stood there. She did not cry. She did not speak. She just stared, her eyes a washed-out, vacant blue. Clutched in one hand was a doll made of corn husks and gray rags. Pinned to the front of her oversized dress with a single, rusty pin was a folded piece of paper. Tamsin was frozen. Her hands, still holding a wet diaper, were suspended in the air. This was wrong. This was a nightmare. Elias moved. He laid his rifle carefully on the porch bench. He knelt, putting himself on the child's level. He did not touch her. "Hello?" he said, his voice softer than Tamsin had ever heard it. "You walked a long way." The girl just stared. "It is warm in here," Elias said, gesturing to the open cabin door. "There is stew. You can eat first. Talk later." The child's gaze flickered to the cabin, then back to him. She gave a small, jerky nod. Elias gently, his fingers careful, undid the pin and took the note. He unfolded it. Tamsin read it over his shoulder. The handwriting was messy, desperate. The pencil lead pressed so hard it had torn the paper in places. "Please let her live better than I did. I cannot—" "Her name is Rose, but she does not answer to it. God forgive me. Example." Elias folded the paper. "Well," he said, his voice practical again. "First, stew." He led the girl inside. She sat at the big table, her feet dangling a foot off the floor. Tamsin brought a bowl, her hands shaking. The girl ate. She ate with a desperate, silent speed, stuffing the stew in with both hands, not stopping until the bowl was clean. When she was done, she looked at them. "We cannot call you Rose," Elias said quietly. "What should we call you?" The girl was silent. She looked around the cabin, at the tools, at the fire, at the bunches of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. "There is a lot of juniper on the porch," Elias offered. "It smells good in the rain. Is juniper a good name?" The girl seemed to consider this. She looked at her corn-husk doll. Then she nodded. "Juniper it is," Elias said. "June, for short." Later that night, the cabin was crowded. Keegan was in her basket. June was asleep on a pallet of blankets Elias had made by the fire. The ragged doll clutched to her chest. Tamsin stood by the stove, her arms crossed tight against her chest. She was watching the new girl breathe. She felt like the walls were closing in. "I will not," she whispered, the words aimed at Elias, who was cleaning his rifle at the table. "I will not be a mother again. I cannot. I cannot." It was a plea, a warning. She had just found her own footing, and the world had immediately sent her another soul to carry. Elias stopped cleaning. He looked at the sleeping girl, then at Tamsin. His face was grim, but not unkind. "No one is asking you to," he said, his voice low and firm. "She is a child. She needed shelter. We had it." He clicked the rifle's action closed. "But do not," he said, meeting Tamsin's desperate gaze. "Let her sleep in the wind. We do not do that here." The cabin at Sage Draw was no longer a refuge. It was a holding cell for 3.5 people. 4, if Elias counted. The space Once a solitary man's tidy domain had become crowded with the small, persistent needs of new life. Keegan lay in a willow basket, one Elias had woven with surprising speed, his large hands moving deftly through the supple branches. Juniper, the girl who had walked out of the desert, slept on the pallet of furs by the stove. Tamsin did not sleep. The first night with the new child in the cabin was an agony. She lay on the cot, every muscle still aching from childbirth, a deep, persistent soreness that reminded her she was still wounded. Outside, the wind had returned, a high, lonely sound that scraped at the sod roof. It was the sound of the world trying to get in. And beneath the wind, another sound. From the pallet, Juniper was whimpering, a low, rhythmic sound, like a trapped animal. Tamsin tried to block it out. She closed her eyes, pulling her own blanket tighter. She was not this child's keeper. She had her own to protect. Then the word, small and broken, cut through the darkness. Ma! Ma! It was not a call. It was a question, a sound of pure, unadulterated loss, whimpered into a dream. Tamsin's eyes snapped open. She held her breath. I will not, she whispered into the dark, a reaffirmation of her promise to herself. I cannot. The wind howled, and again, the whimper. Ma! She sat up, the pain in her abdomen a sharp, hot blade. She swung her legs over the side of the cot, the floorboards cold beneath her bare feet. She looked at Keegan, sleeping peacefully in the basket, safe. Then she looked at the small, shivering lump on the floor. She did not make a decision. Her body simply moved. She crossed the small space in 2 strides. She did not wake the girl. She simply hooked her arms under the child's bony shoulders and knees. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of twigs, and lifted her. Juniper murmured, still asleep, and Tamsin carried her back to the cot. She laid the girl down on the straw, ticking. For a moment, she stood over her, this strange, pale-haired child. Then, Tamsin climbed back in, placing her own body in the middle. Keegan's basket was on the floor to her right, close enough to touch. Juniper was on her left, a small, cold space between them. Tamsin was a barrier between the 2 children, a wall against the night. Just for one night, Tamsin breathed, justifying the act to the shadows. The floor is too cold. But when she woke, the gray dawn light filtering in, she woke to a profound stillness. The wind had died. She was on her back. Keegan was stirring, beginning her small, hungry noises, and on her other side, Juniper was wide awake, her pale, washed-out eyes staring at Tamsin's face. The child was silent, but her small, chapped hand was fisted in the front of Tamsin's wool shirt, holding on with the grim, unconscious tenacity of a drowning person clutching a rope. It was not a request for comfort. It was an anchor. Elias saw the arrangement when he came in from the corral, his arms loaded with fresh firewood. He saw the girl, June, sitting up in the cot, and Tamsin, bleary-eyed, lifting Keegan to her breast. He saw the geography of it. His face did not change. He set the wood by the stove and put the coffee pot on to boil. Later that day, he was outside, digging post holes for a new, smaller fence that sectioned off the front porch from the rest of the corral. Tamsin came out, shading her eyes. What are you doing? A place for them, he said, not looking up, tamping the dirt around a fresh-cut cedar post. So the horses do not bother them, so they do not wander into the arroyo. He was building a sanctuary, one post at a time. He gestured with his chin. The top step is loose. Do you need nails from the box, or would you rather I find some rawhide lashing for the gate hinge? He was not asking her permission. He was asking her opinion. He was including her in the work of fortification. Nails, she said, and went to fetch them. The truce of 2 weeks was stretching, the edges blurring. The work defined them. In the kitchen, Tamsin found a rhythm. She was making cornbread, trying to replicate the loaf Elias had sacrificed to the mud. June stood on a stool beside her, her earlier vacancy replaced by a silent, sharp-eyed focus. She was helping, which meant she was vigorously beating 2 eggs in a tin bowl with a fork. her thin shoulders working hard. A gust of wind blew through the open cabin door, flapping the page of a torn almanac where Tamsin had found the recipe. Elias came in, covered in dust from the corral. He saw her grab for the paper. He walked past her. Not to close the door, the small cabin needed the air, but to his cluttered shelf. He picked up a simple, heavy object. It was a black iron ring, thick as his thumb, pitted with age. He had used it for repairing harnesses. Tamsin had seen it hanging from a nail by his cot. He wordlessly placed the heavy ring on the corner of the flapping paper. It held June, delighted, tapped it with her fork. "It's heavy. It holds," Elias said, and went to the basin to wash the grime from his hands. Tamsin looked at the ring. It was not just a tool. It was his. She had seen him run a leather strap through it. A piece of his own tech. He had given a piece of himself, without comment, to hold down her recipe. It was a small, heavy gesture, and it landed in her chest with more weight than the ring itself. That afternoon, Elias rode to Massilia for grain and salt. He was gone for 6 hours, and every minute of it was a lifetime for Tamsin. She stayed inside, the door barred. He returned at dusk, his face hard. He unloaded the supplies in silence, but Tamsin knew something was wrong. His silence was usually peaceful. This was a coiled, angry quiet. He went to the postal station before he left town. It was the only federal building, the only place he trusted. Deputy Clara Boone ran the desk, a woman with sharp eyes and hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. She sorted mail and wore a badge, and most folks were smart enough to respect both. Elias had leaned on the counter. "Heard Pike is still angry." Clara did not look up from her sorting. "Pike is angry," she said, her voice low. "And Judge Abernathy is angry. Seems they're partners in more than just land speculation." Elias went still. "What kind of partners?" "The kind that trades in contracts." She finally looked at him. "The kind that uses forged indenture papers to move unclaimed children and women south to the mining camps. I've been building a case for a year, Elias, but it's all whispers." She slid a letter into a cubby. "They keep a ledger, a list of every transaction, names, dates, prices." "Abernathy's." Elias said, "It was a statement." "And Pike's." "I need that book, Elias. Or I need a witness who will talk." "I might have a witness," he said. "Well, Pike is not going to let her go. Word at the Coyote Bell is that he's still got her on his books. Goods owed. He's hired 2 trackers from El Paso. He wants his property back, or he wants to make an example of it." Clara's eyes were hard. Get her ready to talk, or get her ready to run. Tamsin did not hear this conversation. She only knew what she saw. She saw Elias come back and check the action on his rifle. She saw him walk the perimeter of the draw, his eyes scanning the ridgeline. The fear, which had receded to a dull ache, returned with a vengeance. She had to leave. This man's quiet strength was not a shield. It was a target, and she was standing right behind it. She waited until the next afternoon. Elias was in the barn, mending a harness. June was on the cot, finally lulled to sleep by the heat, her head resting in Tamsin's lap. Tamsin was supposed to be mending a shirt, but her hands were frozen. She had heard Elias on the porch. Clara Boone had ridden out, a quick, tense visit. Tamsin had heard the words through the open window. Trackers. El Paso. Make an example. She looked at June's sleeping face, the dirt still ingrained in her skin. She looked at Keegan, safe in her basket. She could not run, not with them. They were too small, too slow, and the thought of leaving June, of doing to her what had been done to her, was a physical sickness. The girl's small hand, even in sleep, found the fabric of Tamsin's skirt and held on. The anchor. Tamsin's breath shuddered. She gently moved June's head onto the pillow. She stood up. The fear was still there, a cold, metallic taste in her mouth. But it was not panic anymore. It was fuel. She walked out of the cabin, into the bright, unforgiving sunlight. She walked to the barn. Elias was pulling a strap tight, his back to her. "I need to learn," she said. He stopped, but did not turn. Learn what? To shoot, Tamsin said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not tremble. I need to learn how to stop them. He slowly turned. He studied her face for a long time, seeing the terror and the iron mixed together. He saw the girl who had flinched at his knife, and the woman who was now asking for a gun. He nodded once, a short, sharp gesture. He went not to his own worn Colt, but to the wooden chest at the foot of his cot. He unlocked it and took out a smaller revolver, a Smith Wesson, its barrel shorter, its grip designed for a smaller hand. He led her behind the barn, away from the cabin and the children. He set up a row of tin cans on a log. He pressed the revolver into her hand. It was heavy, but balanced. You hold it too tight, he said, his voice low, standing just behind her left shoulder. He did not touch her. Your shoulders are by your ears. You are fighting it before it even speaks. Tamsin let out a shaky breath. Let them drop, he commanded. She obeyed. Now, raise it. Both hands. Good. Breathe in. Let half that breath out. Hold it. Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it. Do not jerk it. Squeeze it like you are squeezing water from a rag. Slow and steady. Let the hammer falling be a surprise. She aligned the sight. She held her breath. She squeezed. The crack of the shot was deafening. It slammed her hand upward, shocking her, but the bullet hit the dirt just below the can. You jerked, he said calmly. You expected the noise. Do it again. Breathe. Let the breath out. Squeeze. Surprise yourself. She recocked the hammer, the click sounding loud in the silence. She raised the gun, shoulders down. Breathe in. Half out. She focused on the trigger. A slow, steady pressure. The crack was just as loud, but this time she was ready. The gun bucked, and the can jumped off the log. A silence fell. Tamsin stared at the empty space where the can had been, her hand tingling, the smell of sulfur sharp in her nose. Elias handed her another cartridge. Again, he said. She loaded the gun. She raised it. The sound of the next shot, and the next, echoed off the canyon walls. It was not the sound of a woman running. It was the sound of a woman planting her feet. It was a vow, spoken in gunpowder and lead. This time, if the past came for her, it would find her armed. The small Smith Wesson was not the only thing she cleaned. Tamsin was cleaning everything. She scrubbed the cabin floor until the wood grain showed. She scoured the pots until they shone. She mended every torn shirt Elias owned. Her hands were raw, but her mind was clear. It was while she was stitching the lining of Elias's winter duster, her fingers working the heavy sail needle, that the memory surfaced. It was not a thought, but a physical sensation, as sharp and clear as the prick of the needle. She was back in the warehouse, not the day she gave birth, but weeks before. She was sweeping, as she always was. Ferris Pike and Judge Abernathy were in the small, glass-windowed office at the back, their voices low, cigar smoke thick. She had seen Pike take a thick, leather-bound book, a ledger, and unlock a heavy, metal-banded ammunition box. He had placed the ledger inside, along with several stacks of paper, and locked it. Then he had kicked the box under a low shelf, burying it beneath bolts of rough, undyed canvas. He had looked up, seen her. She had immediately looked down, sweeping, making herself small and invisible. Get out. He had spat, and she had fled. She had not thought of it again. It was just another secret of a man who lived by them. Now, it was a thunderclap. A ledger, she said aloud. Elias was at the table, drawing a map. He looked up, his pencil stilled. What ledger? Pike's ledger. The one he keeps with Abernathy. I know where it is. She pressed her hand to her chest, her heart hammering. It is in the warehouse, in an ammo box, under the canvas shelf. Elias put the pencil down. The map he was drawing was the escape route through the high passes. He studied her. You are sure? I saw him put it there. The air in the cabin became very still. This changed everything. The map was for running. The ledger was for fighting. This is not your fight, Tamsin, he said quietly, but there was a new light in his eyes. He put my name in that book, she said, her voice shaking but gaining strength. He put other names in it. He put children in it. He is still using it. You said you wanted to stop them. That book is how—" He nodded slowly. "Getting it will be difficult." "The festival," Tamsin said, the pieces clicking into place. "The Feast of San Lorenzo. It is in 3 days. The whole town will be in the plaza. Drinking. Pike will be in his office, counting the festival profits. His men will be drunk. It is the only time—" Elias looked at her, a long, appraising stare. He was seeing the woman who had hidden a knife in his floor, the woman who had taken in a lost child, the woman who had learned to hit a tin can at 30 paces. "Clara," he said. He folded the map and tucked it into his pocket. The meeting was held 2 nights later, in the back room of the postal station, a place that smelled of paper and sealing wax. Clara Boone's lamp cast long, hard shadows. June and Keegan were asleep back at the cabin, watched over by the rancher's wife from the neighboring canyon, a woman who owed Elias a favor. "It is a trap," Clara said immediately, her arms crossed. "He will have men." "He will," Tamsin agreed. "But they will be at the front, watching the plaza. They will not be watching the dye vats or the tanning yard. I know the back way. I used it to empty his slop buckets for 2 years. I can be in and out in 5 minutes." "And if you are caught?" Clara asked, her eyes sharp. "Then I am just a thief. You two are not involved." "No," Elias said. The word was final. "You go, I go. I will be at the railway siding. I will have the mare. If you are not out in 10 minutes, I am coming in." "I am not coming in," Clara said, tapping the desk. "I will be here. This is federal property. If you get the book, you bring it here. Not the cabin, not the street. Here, if Pike catches you, he can claim you as his indentured property. But if you are on post office land, and I have that book, it becomes a federal matter. He will not dare cross that line." The plan was set. It was thin as a spider's web, and just as easily broken. The night of the festival, Mesilla Crossing was transformed. The drizzle had stopped, and the air was alive. Paper lanterns, painted with crude suns and saints, were strung between the buildings, glowing in the dusk. The mission bell was ringing, not in warning, but in celebration. From the plaza came the sound of guitars, a reedy fiddle, and the rhythmic stamping of boots on wood. The air smelled of roasting chilies, sweet molasses, and cheap tequila. Tamsin moved through the alleyways, a ghost in the alleys of her own past. She wore dark canvas, her hair tied back, the small Smith Wesson tucked into her waistband, cold against her skin. She did not feel the festive air. She only felt the grit under her boots and the steady, cold resolve in her stomach. She reached the back of Pike's property, the tanning yard. The huge, skeletal frames for stretching hides stood empty, like gallows in the dark. The sharp, chemical smell of the tanning liquor burned her nose, a familiar, wretched perfume. She bypassed the main warehouse door. She went to a small, warped cellar door, half hidden by overgrown weeds, that led into the dyeing vats. The bolt was old, and Elias had given her a thin bar of steel. She slid it into the hasp, put her weight against it, and silently levered the rotting wood until the bolt snapped. She was inside. The darkness was absolute, thick with the smell of indigo and sulfur. She stood still, letting her eyes adjust, her heart a cold drum against her ribs. Faintly, through the thick adobe walls, she could hear the festival music. From the front of the warehouse, she heard a man's loud, drunken laugh. She moved, her bare feet making no sound on the packed earth floor. She passed the stacks of wool, the bolts of canvas, and then she was there, the spot. She reached out in the dark, and her hand found it, the rough, splintered wooden support beam. The beam she had gripped, her knuckles white, her body tearing itself apart, while she bore down in silence. A wave of memory, so strong it was a physical blow, hit her. The pain, the blood, the terror, the gag in her mouth. Her knees buckled. She was going to be sick. "Hold your baby," Elias's voice. The first command he ever gave her, It was not a memory of pain. It was a memory of rescue. She straightened. Her legs were shaking, but they held. She was not the girl who had been tied here. She was the woman who had come back to burn the past to the ground. She moved to the low shelf, knelt, and began pulling away the heavy bolts of canvas. They were dusty, heavy. Her breath was coming fast, and then her fingers hit metal. The box. It was locked, just as she remembered. She pulled the steel bar from her belt. She jammed it into the hinge mechanism, not the lock. She put all her weight, all her anger, all her grief into it. The metal shrieked, a sound so loud in the silence it felt like a gunshot. She froze. From the front, the drunken laughter stopped. A chair scraped. What was that? Rats, another voice slurred. Probably a damn coyote in the hides. Tamsin did not wait. She yanked the lid open. The hinges were broken. Inside papers and the thick dark spine of the ledger. She grabbed it, shoving it deep inside her shirt, the cold leather sharp against her stomach. She turned to run. A lantern flared, blinding her. Silas Dorn stood in the gap between the crates, the silver scar on his lip a pale crescent in the yellow light. His other hand held a revolver, aimed at her chest. Well, he sneered, his voice soft. Look what the cat drug back in. The boss is going to be so pleased to see you. Tamsin did not speak. She did not raise her hands. She launched herself sideways, into the towering stacks of wool blankets. She hit them hard, and the entire pile went over with a muffled whoomph, right onto Dorn. He roared, the lantern flying, his gun discharging into the ceiling, the warehouse filled with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Tamsin scrambled, crawling over the fallen blankets. She heard him cursing, trying to get untangled. She ran. She burst out of the cellar door, back into the tanning yard. Stop her! Dorn screamed from inside. She ran, her lungs burning, pumping her arms. She was fast, but she heard his heavy boots right behind her. He was faster. She burst through the tanning yard gate and into the alley that ran beside the railway line. The noise of the festival was louder here, confusing. Dorn was on her. He grabbed a fistful of her hair, yanking her back. She screamed, a raw, furious sound, and spun, raking her nails across his face. He howled and backhanded her, sending her sprawling into the mud. He raised his revolver. Should have stayed gone, girl. A shadow moved, detaching itself from the side of a cattle car. It was not a man. It was a force. Elias. He did not draw his gun. He was holding a heavy stable door, one he had seemingly unhinged from a nearby shed. He swung it like a shield, or a battering ram. The thick wood hit Dorn square in the chest with a sound like a wet axe splitting timber. Dorn's breath exploded from his body, his gun firing uselessly into the sky as he was slammed backward against the alley wall. Elias did not check on him. He grabbed Tamsin's arm, hauling her to her feet. The red mare was there, tethered, its eyes wide with the noise. Go to Boone, Elias yelled, shoving her toward the horse. A shot snapped past Tamsin's ear, kicking up sparks where it hit the rail. Another of Pike's men, drawn by the noise, was at the end of the alley. Elias drew his Colt, not in a fast draw, but in a deliberate, measured motion. He did not fire at the man. He fired at the heavy signal lantern hanging over his head. The lantern exploded in a shower of glass and burning oil, and the man screamed, diving for cover. Tamsin was on the mare's back. She did not need the stirrup. She hauled herself up. Grabbing a handful of mane, she dug her heels in. Another shot. This one was close. She felt a thwack as a bullet tore through the felt of the hat Elias had given her, spinning it from her head. Her hair, tied only by a leather thong, tumbled down, blinding her. She did not slow. She was riding low over the mare's neck, one hand clutching the ledger through her shirt, the other fisted in the mane. She tasted mud and grit, with a single, fluid, practiced motion. She let go of the mane, grabbed her own hair, twisted it into a thick rope, and retied it, high and tight. It was a soldier's move, a survivor's move. Her vision was clear. She galloped past the plaza, a dark streak on the edge of the light, scattering drunks, and slid the mare to a halt in the alley behind the post office. The back door opened a crack. "In here, now!" Clara Boone's voice. Tamsin fell from the horse, stumbled inside. The door was barred. Elias slid in a second later, his chest heaving, his gun back in its holster. They stood in the absolute darkness of the mail-sorting room, the only sound their 3 ragged breaths, sucking wind. Clara struck a match. The small flame illuminated 3 faces, streaked with sweat and dirt. She lit her desk lamp, turning the wick low. "You got it." Clara's voice was a rasp. Tamsin's hands were shaking so hard she could barely unbutton her shirt. She pulled the ledger out. It was heavy, solid. She slapped it onto the desk. The 3 of them stared at it. Clara opened the cover. The pages were filled with neat, precise columns of black ink. Names Tamsin did not know. Names of women. Names of children. Dates of acquisition. Prices of sale. And on the bottom of nearly every page, pressed into the paper with arrogant finality, was the embossed, official seal of Judge Abernathy. "My God," Clara whispered. She ran a finger down a list of names. He was selling them to the silver mines in Chihuahua. 5 children in 1 week. Elias looked at Tamsin, his face grim, but his eyes, there was a dark pride in them. Clara looked up, her own eyes bright with a cold, righteous fury. "You did it, Tamsin?" She closed the book, the sound a definitive, heavy thud. "It is enough," she said. "It is enough to burn the whole damn nest to the ground." Tamsin stood, her body starting to tremble, the adrenaline draining away. She reached out and put her hand on the book. The leather cover was rough, worn at the edges. It felt solid, real. It felt like the end of one life and the beginning of another. It was not just a book. It was an anchor. It was the truth. The ride back to Sage Draw was a frantic, punishing race against a sun that had not yet risen. They did not speak. Elias on his heavy gelding, Tamsin on the swift red mare. The ledger, tucked inside her shirt, felt like a block of ice against her ribs, a cold, heavy weight of truth. Behind them, the sounds of the festival, the music. The laughter faded, replaced by the pounding of hooves and the sawing of their own breath. They were not fools. They knew Pike would not wait for the law. The ledger was his ruin, and Tamsin was the woman who had taken it. He was not a man of patience. He was a man of brutal, immediate solutions. When they reached the draw, the rancher's wife was already on the porch, holding a lantern, her face etched with worry. Tamsin swung down from the mare, her legs shaking from the ride, and ran inside. June was asleep on the cot, her small hand still clutching the corn-husk doll. Keegan was breathing deeply in her willow basket. For a half-second, the peaceful, domestic scene was so normal it made the night's terror feel like a dream. "They are coming," Elias said from the doorway. He was not speaking to Tamsin, but to the other woman. "Take your wagon. Ride north to the pass. Do not stop until you reach Fort Selden." "And you?" the woman asked, her hand at her throat. "We are staying," Tamsin said. She was already checking the load in the Smith Wesson. Elias nodded at the woman. "Go, now. We will hold the draw." The woman fled. Tamsin and Elias were alone. The silence of the cabin broken only by the click of Elias's rifle bolt. "They will be here by sunup," Elias said. He was pulling a coil of thin, strong wire from his supply chest. "They will be angry, and they will be fast." "How many?" "Pike, Dorn, if he can still ride, and whatever hired guns he keeps. I count 3 others. 5, maybe 6. We are 2. "They are coming for the book," Tamsin said. "They are coming for you," Elias corrected, his voice flat. "The book is just the reason." He moved outside into the pre-dawn gray, and Tamsin followed. He worked with a speed she had never seen, his movements precise and economical. He unwound the wire, stretching it across the main entrance to the corral, about knee-high to a horse. He secured one end to the main gate post, the other. He ran back toward a heavy, hastily built scaffolding of lumber he had been using to repair the barn roof. He did not secure it. He left the coil hidden in the dirt. "What is that?" Tamsin asked. Horses hate wire, he said, especially at a run. But that is not the trap. He pointed to the scaffolding. I built it to be unstable. A few good kicks. He did not finish. He was already moving, kicking dirt and straw over the wire, hiding its metallic sheen. Your job is the children. He led her to the root cellar, its door a heavy wooden rectangle flat on the ground behind the cabin. It is deep. The walls are thick. You will hear the fight. It will be loud. He looked at her, his eyes dark in the thin light. You stay down. You keep them quiet. No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, you protect them. Tamsin nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She went inside and lifted the sleeping June from the cot. The girl stirred, her eyes opening, wide and vacant with sleep. It is a game. June, Tamsin whispered, her voice rough. We are going to hide in the dark. You have to be so quiet. She carried her to the cellar. June did not protest, simply laid her head on Tamsin's shoulder. Tamsin returned for Keegan, lifting the basket. She paused at the cellar door. She looked at Elias. He was standing by the corral, his rifle in his hand, a silhouette against a sky that was turning a sick, bruised purple. He looked impossibly alone. Tamsin climbed down into the cellar, the smell of damp earth and potatoes enveloping her. She settled the children on a pile of empty grain sacks. She held June's small, cold hand. When is the game over? June whispered, her voice a tiny thread in the dark. Tamsin swallowed, trying to steady her own voice. When you hear me sing, she said, when you hear me sing Amazing Grace, you will know it is safe. Not 1 second before. Do you understand? Singing, June repeated, a small, sleepy nod. Tamsin kissed her forehead. She looked at Keegan, blissfully asleep. She climbed the ladder and pulled the heavy door down, leaving only a half-inch gap for air. She ran back to the cabin. The sun was just touching the rim of the canyon when they came. 5 riders. A cloud of low, red dust that looked like fire on the horizon. They rode hard, not as a posse, but as a mob. Pike was in the lead, his face purple with rage. Beside him, his arm in a crude sling, was Silas Dorn. 3 other men, faces hard and anonymous, fanned out behind them. Rourke, Pike bellowed, sliding his horse to a halt just beyond the wire. Send the girl out, send her out, and I will let you live. Elias stepped onto the porch, his rifle held low. She is not here. Pike, you are trespassing. Liar! Dorn spat, his face contorted. He spurred his horse forward, right at the wire. Elias did not shoot. He watched. The horse hit the wire at a canter. It did not fall, but it screamed, a high, terrified sound, and reared. Its front legs tangled. Dorn, his arm useless, was thrown hard, hitting the dirt and rolling. It was the signal. Chaos erupted. Elias fired, not at Pike, but at the man to his left. The shot was perfect. A thud of lead hitting flesh. The man slumped over his saddle, and his horse bolted. Spread out, Pike roared. Burn him out. The remaining 2 riders split, one cutting toward the barn, the other firing at the cabin. Bullets ripped through the windows, sending glass and splintered wood flying. Tamsin was on the floor, the heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove in her hand. Elias was low, using the porch rail as cover, firing and moving. He dropped the second rider as the man tried to flank the cabin. A clean shot to the chest, but the third man was already off his horse, diving into the barn, firing from the hayloft. Elias was pinned. He saw Dorn on the ground, crawling toward his dropped pistol. Elias fired at him, kicking up dirt, but Dorn was too low. Tamsin, Elias roared. The barn, he is in the hayloft. Tamsin heard him. She crawled to the back door, the skillet heavy in her hand. She could see Dorn, his face a mask of pain, his good hand stretching, his fingers just inches from his gun. And she saw Elias forced to choose the man in the loft or the man on the ground. Elias aimed at the loft, firing into the darkness. Dorn's fingers closed around his pistol. He grinned, a broken, bloody expression. and started to raise the gun toward Elias's exposed back. Tamsin did not think. She rose from her crouch, took 2 running steps, and threw the skillet with all the force of her fear and her rage. She threw it not at his head, but, as Elias had taught her to shoot, she aimed for the center of his action. The heavy iron pan spun, a black disk in the morning light, and struck Silas Dorn squarely on his good elbow, the one he was using to prop himself up. The sound was obscene, a wet, hard crack. It was not a sound of metal on flesh, but of metal on bone. Dorn's scream was high and thin. The pistol fired, a useless shot into the ground, and he collapsed, clutching the shattered ruin of his arm. Tamsin ducked back as Pike, seeing his advantage lost, roared in fury. He spurred his horse directly at the porch. Leaping it, the animal's hooves slammed onto the wood, and Pike leaned down, his face a mask of hatred. "You!" he screamed, not at Elias but at Tamsin, who was scrambling back. He grabbed the front of her shirt, his grip like a steel trap, and hauled her bodily off the porch, dragging her into the yard. Elias fired, but Pike used Tamsin as a shield. Holding her in front of him, he dragged her toward the horse trough, his grip unbreakable. "My property," he bellowed, shaking her like a rag. "You are my property. I bought you, and I will break you." He threw her to the ground, his horse rearing over her, and he raised his pistol. And in that second, Tamsin was not afraid. The word property had burned away the terror. All that was left was a pure, cold clarity. She looked up at him, her eyes as calm and hard as river stones. She was not property. She was a mother. "Now!" "Elias," she screamed. Elias was no longer on the porch. He had run, unseen, to the hidden coil of wire. He had braced himself. When she screamed, he pulled. He pulled with all his strength, yanking the wire that was still tangled in the legs of Dorn's panicked horse. The horse screamed and lunged, but the wire was attached to the heavy corral gate. The gate, its hinges already weakened by Elias, tore free, but the wire held, and the panicked horse, in its terror, slammed sideways into the unstable scaffolding. It happened in an instant. A groan of stressed wood, and then the entire structure, heavy beams, planks, and tools collapsed in a thunderous avalanche of lumber, right on top of Pike and his horse. Pike's horse went down, screaming. Pike was thrown clear, but his pistol was gone, and he landed hard. The air knocked from his lungs. He looked up, stunned, blinking, as Tamsin rose to her feet. She did not run. She walked toward him. Pike scrambled, trying to get to his feet, but his leg was twisted. He looked at her, his arrogance replaced by a sudden, dawning fear. Tamsin circled him. He had lost his gun. Elias was now covering the man in the hayloft. Dorn was incapacitated. It was just her and Pike. "You are nothing," Pike wheezed, trying to crawl backward. "A runaway. Tamsin put her hand in her pocket. Pike flinched, thinking she had a gun. She pulled out a small, coiled piece of sisal rope, a piece she used for the laundry line. She uncoiled it. "I know knots," she said, her voice quiet. Pike's eyes went wide. He tried to lunge. Tamsin was faster. She sidestepped, grabbed his wrist, and twisted. It was the move she had practiced with ropes. The taut line hitch, a movement of leverage, not strength. His wrist bent at an impossible angle. He roared, and as he bent, her knee came up like a spring, connecting with his jaw with a solid, definitive thud. Pike's head snapped back, and he collapsed into the mud, unconscious. A loud, shrill whistle cut the air. Deputy Clara Boone was at the head of the draw, not alone, but with 2 federal marshals, their horses fresh. She had ridden for them the moment Elias had confirmed the ledger. She rode in, her shotgun resting on her lap. "Looks like you handled the welcoming party," she said, her voice dry. She dismounted and walked to Pike, kicking his leg. "Ferris Pike, you are under arrest for—" A movement. Dorn. He was crawling. He had ignored his shattered arms. His teeth were gritted, his face pale and slick with sweat. He was crawling toward the knife he had dropped. "Dorn, stay down!" Clara yelled, raising her shotgun. A small, sharp thwip sound. A 4-inch wooden bolt suddenly appeared, pinning Dorn's hat to the dusty ground. Dorn froze, his eyes wide with shock. On the porch, standing in the doorway, was June. She was holding a small, beautifully made crossbow, its springs and trigger clearly fashioned by Elias. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady. She had been told to hide, but she had not been told to be helpless. The man in the hayloft threw his gun down. I give. The fight was over. A new sound pierced the sudden silence. A thin, insistent wail. Keegan, from the cellar. She had heard the cessation of violence, and she was demanding her breakfast. Tamsin's legs gave out. She sat heavily in the mud, her entire body shaking in a violent, uncontrollable tremor. The adrenaline was gone, leaving only a vast, aching emptiness. Elias was at her side. He said nothing. He simply knelt beside her. He did not hug her. He did not try to comfort her. He just placed his hand on her back, between her shoulder blades. The touch was light, barely there, a whisper of contact, but it was the most solid thing she had ever felt. It was a promise. It was an anchor. Tamsin leaned into the touch, closing her eyes. Is it over? She whispered, the words ragged. Elias looked at Clara, who was cuffing Pike, and at the marshals dragging the other men out. No, Elias said, his voice low. Now comes the trial. Clara heard him. She walked over, wiping the grime from her face. He is right, she said, nodding at the cellar. We got the men, but we still have to find the people in that book. The work is not over. The marshals had left, Pike, Dorn, and their broken men were gone, hauled away toward Fort Selden, toward the justice of a federal court. The blood had been washed from the porch by a slow, steady rain that had begun just after sunrise. A clean, gray sheet of water that muffled the world and turned the dust of the draw into dark, quiet mud. Inside the cabin, the stillness was profound. It was a silence different from the one before, not a wary truce, but a shared, bone-deep exhaustion. The fight was over, but the adrenaline had left them hollowed out, their nerves humming like plucked wires. Elias had rebuilt the fire, and the small room was warm, filled with the scent of burning cedar and the resinous smell of the pine logs that formed the walls. He had barred the door. Tamsin had cleaned the children, fed them, and watched them fall into a sleep so deep it was almost a coma, the day's terror finally releasing them. Keegan was in her willow basket, her small fists curled. June was on her pallet, the crossbow resting on the floor beside her. Now, only the two of them were awake. Tamsin had washed the grime and gunpowder from her face in the basin. Elias had done the same, his sleeves rolled up, his forearms dark with hair and streaked with soot. They stood in the small space between the table and the cot, not touching. The only sounds were the soft hiss of the fire and the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the sod roof. They were half a step apart. It was a distance close enough to feel the heat radiating from each other's bodies, close enough to hear the unsteady hitch in Tamsin's breath, but it was far enough, still, to be separate, far enough to ask, without words, if this was real. Tamsin's gaze was on his arm. Below the rolled sleeve, just above the elbow, was a pale, puckered scar, the size of a silver dollar, an old wound. Without thinking, her hand lifted, her fingers, still raw from the skillet handle and the laundry rope, were hesitant. She did not touch him, not quite, just hovered over the damaged skin. He did not move. He simply watched her hand. She finally let her fingertips brush the scar. It was tough, leathery. A long time ago, he said, his voice a low rumble. He captured her hand. He did not grab it. He simply turned his own, his palm meeting hers, and threaded his fingers through hers. He looked down at their joined hands. His thumb moved, rubbing lightly over the new, hard calluses on her fingers. He felt the roughness where she had gripped the pistol, where she had tied the knots, where she had held her children. He acknowledged her fight with a single, silent touch. He raised his eyes to hers. The stillness in them was gone. replaced by something deep and turbulent. A banked fire she had only glimpsed before. He saw the question in her eyes, the fear, but beneath it, something new. A weariness that was not just exhaustion, but a weariness of being alone. She did not know how to ask. She did not know what she was asking for, so she just nodded. A tiny, almost imperceptible movement of her chin. He saw it. He let go of her hand, but only to raise his own to her face. His calloused thumb brushed the side of her jaw. His voice was a rasp, so quiet it was almost lost in the rain. "If you change your mind," he whispered, "at any second, you just say." He was giving her the power. He was not Pike. He was not a man who took that, more than anything, broke the last of her defenses. She did not nod again. She leaned into his touch, closing the final few inches between them, and pressed her mouth to his. The first kiss was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of healing. It was salt and smoke and gunpowder, and beneath it all, the clean taste of rain. It was warm. It was slow. It was not a claiming. It was a question and an answer. His other hand came to rest on her back, his palm flat between her shoulder blades. It was not the possessive grip of a man at a woman's waist. It was the same, solid, anchoring touch he had given her in the yard. "I am here. You are safe." Her own hands, shaking, found their way up his chest. She felt the heavy, solid beat of his heart under her palm, a rhythm as steady as his hammer on the anvil. Her fingers spread, tracing the line of his shoulders, feeling the coiled strength, the power he held in check. He was a man who knew how to hold on. He was a man who knew when to let go. The kiss changed. The healing gave way to a sudden, sharp hunger, a need that had been buried under years of survival. It was the desperate, starved recognition of two people who had been alone for too long. His mouth opened over hers, and she answered, her breath catching. He pulled her closer, his hand sliding from her back to her waist, fitting her against him. She was not a piece of property. She was his equal. She was a wall of fire. "Elias," she breathed, the name a prayer against his lips. He moved them backward, his steps sure, hers stumbling, until the back of her legs hit the cot. They bumped the table as they moved. The heavy iron ring, the one he had placed on her recipe, rattled on the wood. It hit the side of a tin mug with a small, clear ching. The sound cut through the haze. Tamsin's eyes opened. She was not in the warehouse. She was not in the mud. She was here, in the warm cabin, in his arms. The sound was a tiny bell, announcing that this, now, was real. He mistook her stillness for hesitation. "Tamsin," he asked, his voice thick, ready to pull away. She answered him by reaching for the buttons of his shirt. Her fingers were clumsy, shaking, but resolute. He stopped her, his hand covering hers. He undid the buttons himself, his eyes never leaving hers. Then, his fingers went to the buttons of her rough wool shirt. He was slow, deliberate. Each touch was a question. Are you sure she did not flinch? She watched his hands. When the last button came free, he did not tear the shirt away. He pushed the fabric back, over her shoulders. The cool air of the room hit her skin, followed instantly by the heat of his hand, broad and rough, cupped her shoulder, his thumb tracing her collarbone. They fell onto the cot together, a tangle of limbs and blankets. It was not a gentle lowering. It was a collision. It was two survivors, battered and exhausted, finally reaching shore, collapsing onto the sand. Skin against skin was an answer more profound than 1,000 promises. It was the end of commerce. It was the end of indenture. His hands on her were not the hands of an owner, but of a worshipper. Her hands on him were not the hands of a servant, but of an explorer. It was awkward and real and desperate. Their breath mingled with the sound of the rain, a matched, ragged rhythm. Much, much later, the cabin was still. The rain had softened to a fine, whispering mist. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing, red-gold embers, casting a faint, warm light over the room. Tamsin lay with her head on Elias's chest, her ear against his ribs. listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. Her body was heavy, sore, but settled. A deep, profound peace she had never known had seeped into her bones. In the dark, she smiled, a small, tired curve of her mouth. He was not asleep. His hand, which had been resting on her hip, moved. He stroked her hair, his fingers gently brushing the tangled strands away from her face, tucking them behind her ear. "Elias," she whispered, just to say his name. He answered, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "Tamsin." It was not a promise of forever. It was a confirmation of right now. They were not the runaway and the horseman. They were two people in a small, safe room, reclaiming their own bodies from a world that had tried to price them. From the corner, Keegan let out a soft, milky sigh, her breathing deep and even in the willow basket. Across the room, on her pallet, June murmured, her legs kicking at the fur blanket, dreaming of a red mare, dreaming of horizons. Tamsin shifted, turning her head just enough to see out the small window. The storm had passed entirely. The clouds had torn apart, and through the gap, a single, sharp sliver of starlight shone down, bright and impossibly clear. The traveling court was convened at Fort Selden, not in a hall of justice, but in a long, repurposed cavalry barracks. The air was suffocating, thick with the smell of sweat, unwashed wool, and the alkali dust that blew in through the propped-open doors. The room was packed. The entirety of Massilia Crossing, it seemed, had made the journey, cramming the benches, standing 3 deep along the walls. They were drawn by a thirst that was equal parts morbid curiosity and a desperate, unfamiliar hunger for actual justice. At the front, on a raised platform, sat Judge Isaac Reeves. He had been sent down from Santa Fe to fill the vacuum left by Abernathy's sudden flight. Reeves was a man carved from hardwood, with an iron-gray beard and eyes that missed nothing. He was not a man of the territory. He was a man of the federal bench, and he looked upon the crowded, rowdy room with unconcealed distaste. At the defendant's table sat Ferris Pike and Silas Dorn. Pike was diminished. His tailored waistcoat was wrinkled, his face a mottled gray. Beside him, his high-priced lawyer from El Paso looked bored and immaculate, shuffling papers. Silas Dorn was a broken thing, his arms bound in thick, dirty bandages, his face pale and slick with pain. He stared at the floor, a caged animal. Elias and Tamsin sat in the front row. Elias was dressed as he always was, in his canvas work clothes, his duster left at the door. He looked solid, immovable, a piece of the landscape. Tamsin sat beside him. She wore her mended dress. Her hair was tied back severely, in her lap. Her hands were clasped, but not in prayer. She was turning the heavy iron harness ring over and over, the metal a cold, solid anchor in her palms. "This court is now in session," Judge Reeves announced, his voice a gravelly boom that silenced the room instantly. The prosecution was not a high-priced lawyer. It was Deputy Clara Boone. She stood, her badge polished, her voice devoid of theatrics. "Your Honor, the prosecution brings a case of trafficking, conspiracy, fraud, and kidnapping against Mr. Pike and Mr. Dorn and—" She paused, letting the weight land. "In absentia, against Judge Amos Abernathy." A gasp went through the room. It was one thing to whisper the judge's name. It was another to hear it spoken as a criminal. Pike's lawyer, a man named Hargrove, rose smoothly. "Objection. Your Honor, my client is a respected merchant. These are outrageous, baseless slanders against an esteemed member of the judiciary. Sit down, Mr. Hargrove," Reeves said, his voice flat. "It is not slander if it is proven. Deputy Boone, proceed with your evidence." Boone nodded. She walked not to the witness stand, but to her own table. She lifted a heavy object and placed it on the judge's bench with a solid, definitive thud. It was the ledger. "We present," Boone said, her voice clear and carrying, "the business ledger of Ferris Pike and, as the evidence will show, of Judge Abernathy." Hargrove was on his feet again. "Stolen property. Your Honor illegally obtained this ledger was taken in a violent armed robbery of my client's place of business." Duly noted, Counselor, Reeves said, his eyes on the book. I will rule on its admissibility after I have heard how it was obtained. He looked at Boone. Call your first witness. The prosecution calls Tamsin Vale. A wave of whispers followed her as she stood. Every eye in the room was on her. She was the ghost, the runaway, the woman who had started this fire. She walked to the stand, her steps measured, her back straight. As she passed the defendant's table, Pike's eyes met hers. They were not angry. They were filled with a cold, possessive hatred. She took the oath. Hargrove began the cross-examination immediately. A privilege granted to challenge the witness's very standing. He smiled, a thin, reptilian expression. Miss Vale, or is it Mrs. Vale? It is hard to keep track. You were an employee of Mr. Pike's, were you not? No, Tamsin said. Her voice was quiet, but the room was so silent that every word was clear. No, Hargrove feigned surprise. You lived in his warehouse. You ate his food. What would you call yourself? His property, Tamsin said. The lawyer's smile faltered. A turn of phrase. You were, in fact, an indentured servant, bound by a legal contract. Were you not? I was bound by a paper signed by Judge Abernathy. A legal document, Hargrove pressed. And you ran away. You violated this legal contract. I escaped, Tamsin said. So you admit, he pounced, that you are a runaway, a fugitive from a legal agreement, a woman whose word, by definition, is untrustworthy. You broke the law, did you not? Tamsin looked at him. She was not angry. She was not afraid. She was just still. I broke his ropes. I stole his ledger. And I would do it again. So you are a thief, too. Hargrove threw his hands up, appealing to the jury. Your Honor, this witness is self-admittedly a criminal. Her testimony is tainted. Her character is non-existent. Does her character? Judge Reeves interrupted, his voice cutting through Hargrove's performance. Change the ink in this book. Sit down. Counselor, Deputy Boone, your witness. Boone stood. She did not look at the jury. She looked at Tamsin. Tamsin, I want you to tell the court about the day your daughter was born. Hargrove jumped up. Objection irrelevant and inflammatory. We are here to discuss a stolen ledger, not a childbirth. I believe, Judge Reeves said, leaning forward. It is entirely relevant to the charge of trafficking. Overruled. Proceed. Deputy. Tamsin's hands tightened on the iron ring in her lap. She looked past Pike, past the jury, to the back wall. Elias was watching her. He did not look at the judge. He did not look at the men who had tried to kill them. He looked only at her. He was her anchor. She took a breath. It was in the warehouse, she began, her voice low and steady. The back room, where he keeps the indigo dye and the spoiled burlap. It smelled of wet lime and rust. Mr. Pike, had me tied. Tied while in labor, Boone asked, her voice quiet. My wrists, to a support beam. She held up her hands, showing the faint, pale scars. He said it was to keep me from making a sound. He had gentlemen callers coming. A woman in the back row made a small, sick sound. And then the baby was born, Tamsin said, her voice flat. A simple statement of fact. He did not untie me. He put a gag in my mouth. His men, they gathered. For a transaction. What were they selling? Me. He had my indenture paper, the one signed by the judge. He was holding an auction. For me. And the baby. Tamsin's gaze finally moved. She looked at the jury. 12 ranchers and shopkeepers, their faces hard and sun-scorched. The baby, my daughter, she was still attached to me. Mr. Dorn, the man sitting there, he wrapped her in a cornmeal sack. He put her on the grain scale, to weigh her. The room was dead. It was the silence of a tomb. Even Hargrove had gone pale. And what? Boone said, her voice barely a whisper. Did they say? Tamsin's eyes found Ferris Pike. She spoke the words, not to the court, but to him. They laughed, and one of them said, A special, tonight only, sold with the issue, a fresh-birthed mother. The silence broke. It was not a gasp, but a low, collective groan of disgust. A juror in the front row, a man known for his harshness, visibly flinched, his eyes closing. "I have no further questions," Boone said, and sat down. Hargrove stood, but he was beaten. He knew it. A tragic story," he stammered. "If it is true, but it changes nothing. It does not prove these wild accusations of trafficking. It does not prove conspiracy." "No," Boone said, standing again. "It does not, but this does." She held up the ledger. "And so does my final witness. The prosecution calls Mrs. Ilara Albright, a small, gray-haired woman who ran the respectable boarding house in Massilia, walked to the stand. She looked terrified, but resolute. "Mrs. Albright," Boone said, "you are the proprietress of the Massilia boarding house." "I am." "Did Judge Abernathy keep a room there?" "He did, for 2 years, room number 4. "And did he leave in a hurry, approximately 2 weeks ago?" "He did, left in the middle of the night, did not even pack his trunk. Or," she added, "pay his bill." Hargrove groaned. "And in cleaning his room," Boone continued. "Did you find anything he left behind?" "I did, Mrs. Albright said." She reached into her reticule and produced a thin packet of letters, tied with a blue ribbon. "I was going to burn them, but I read one, and I felt sick. I brought them to Deputy Boone this morning." Boone took the letters. "Your Honor, we submit these letters from Judge Abernathy to Mr. Ferris Pike. They discuss, in detail, the acquisition of 2 young women from the East and the transport arrangements for shipping children to the mining camps in Chihuahua." She handed one to the judge and one to the jury foreman. "The signature," Boone said, "is a perfect match for the ones in this ledger, as is the imprint of his judicial seal." It was over. The lawyer's bluster, the arguments of theft, all of it evaporated. The letters and the ledger were a matched set. It was not just Pike's business. It was a partnership. Judge Reeves looked at the jury. "You have heard the testimony. You have seen the evidence. I suspect you do not need long." He was right. They were gone for less than 10 minutes. The foreman stood. "On all counts, for Mr. Pike guilty. On all counts, for Mr. Dorn guilty." The room exhaled. Pike slumped in his chair, a ruined man. Judge Reeves put his hands on the bench. "Ferris Pike, you have used your station to prey on the weak, to trade in human misery. You are a cancer on this territory. I sentence you to 30 years of hard labor at the federal prison in Yuma. May God have mercy on your soul, for this court has none." Pike did not move. "Silas Dorn, you are a tool, a brutal instrument for a brutal man. Your capacity for violence is at an end. I sentence you to be exiled from this territory, to labor on the Union Pacific line, where you can perhaps do some good for the nation you have so grievously offended. Get him out of my sight." Marshals hauled the 2 men away, Dorn weeping in pain, Pike utterly silent. Judge Reeves was not finished. He held up the ledger. "And as to the matter of Judge Amos Abernathy," he boomed, "a federal warrant for his immediate arrest is hereby issued. He is a fugitive from justice, and let this be recorded." He looked out at the room, at the townspeople, at Tamsin. "This court hereby declares any and all indenture contracts, bills of sale, or land deeds bearing the signature or seal of Judge Amos Abernathy, retroactive to 1 year from this date, to be fraudulent, null and utterly void." A wind of pure, unadulterated shock swept the room. He had not just convicted Pike. He had undone Abernathy's entire corrupt history. He had freed them all. The courtroom erupted. People were cheering, weeping, embracing. The sound was deafening. Tamsin sat still through all of it. The noise washed over her. She felt Elias's hand on her arm. She stood, her legs weak. She walked down the aisle, the crowd parting for her. They were not looking at a victim. They were not looking at a runaway. They were looking at the woman who had brought the whole rotten structure down. She stepped out of the dark, suffocating barracks and into the bright, blinding sunlight of the New Mexico afternoon. She had to stop, her hand rising to shield her eyes. The world looked new, imposters, sharp-edged. Elias was at her side. He did not say a word. He just held out his hand. Tamsin looked at her own hands, still clutching the iron ring. She took a deep breath, the air clean and hot, and put her hand in his. She was not a victim. She was not property. She was a woman who had, for the first time in her life, the absolute, terrifying, and beautiful right to decide what her own name would mean tomorrow. The name of the place changed on no map, but in the mouths of the people who began to find their way there. The two words, Sage Draw, were a description of a landscape. The new words, Haven Fork, were a promise. Elias, with Tamsin directing, painted a new sign. He was a good builder, but a poor artist. The letters were thick and uneven, but the words were plain. He hung it from the new gate he had built, the one June's crossbow bolt had missed. The sign did not say way station. It said, Haven Fork, whoever makes it here, eats first, then we talk. And they came. The verdict of the trial had cracked open the territory. With Abernathy a fugitive and his network exposed, the women and children he had trafficked, the ones hidden in mining camps or passed off as orphans, began to trickle back. They came on foot, or on the backs of government mules, or sent by Clara Boone. They were thin, silent, and watchful, their eyes holding the same vacancy Tamsin had once seen in her own. They came to Haven Fork. Tamsin's first act was to find a new book, not a dark, leather-bound ledger of debt, but a simple storekeeper's journal with a plain brown cover. She opened it to the first page, dipped a pen in ink, and began her own accounting. It was not a list of prices. It was a register of names. Ilara, from the Cobre Mines. Arrived October 7th, hand burned. Good with horses, Sophie, and her son, Mateo, from El Paso, seeking passage to her sister in California. Left October 12th, Juniper, found September 20th. She stays. Each line was a life taken out of the shadows. Each name she wrote was a quiet act of defiance, a way of giving back what Pike and Abernathy had stolen. Tamsin was no longer a victim. She was a witness. Life settled into the deep, abiding rhythm of work. The draw, which had been a place of solitary survival, became a place of noisy, chaotic construction. Elias, with the help of two men Tamsin had vouched for, was building a new, long stable, the air sharp with the clean, resinous scent of fresh-cut pine. He was not just mending. He was building for a future. June, no longer a ghost, was now a small, fierce shadow at his side. She had a new crossbow, one built for her size, and she practiced daily. Elias was a patient teacher. You do not aim at what you are angry at, he told her, his hand steadying her arm. You aim at what you must. There is a difference. June, who had never had a lesson in anything but survival, absorbed this new code of ethics, her small face serious. Keegan was no longer an infant in a basket. She was a person. She was a small, determined girl with Tamsin's dark, watchful eyes and Elias's stubborn chin. She had, in the last month, discovered her feet. The wide, sun-warmed porch Elias had built became her universe. She would pull herself up on the rails, her small, bare feet planted in the sunlight, and take staggering, triumphant steps from one post to the next, babbling at the chickens. Tamsin would watch her, a pot in her hand, her heart caught in her throat. Every step Keegan took was a step away from the indigo darkness of the warehouse, a step into a life Tamsin had never believed possible. The 2 weeks Tamsin had agreed to had become 2 months, then 3. The map Elias had drawn of the high passes lay folded at the bottom of her belongings, forgotten. The red mare she had been promised was now just her mare. One afternoon, the light was a thick, buttery gold. The autumn air was crisp, and the sky was a hard, cloudless blue. Elias had just finished watering the horses. Tamsin was hanging laundry, the white sheets bright against the dark canyon wall. June was teaching Keegan how to read a picture book, which mostly involved pointing and shouting, "Horse!" Elias walked over to Tamsin. He did not say anything, just stood beside her, watching her pin a shirt to the line. "I am not leaving," Tamsin said, not looking at him. She did not know why she said it. It just needed to be said aloud. "I know," he said. "This is home. June thinks of it as home. Keegan will know nothing else." "Good," he said. "It is good wood. It will last." She turned to him. The breeze coming down the draw was cool, and it whipped a strand of her hair across her face. He reached out and tucked it behind her ear, his rough fingers gentle. "I'll stay," he said, his voice low. It was not a question. It was a statement. Her breath hitched. She looked into his eyes, the color of a quiet river, and saw her own reflection. "You stay," she whispered, and that was it. They did not go to a church. They did not seek out a judge. They walked, hand in hand, to the stone well in the center of the yard, the source of their water, the thing that gave them life in the dry canyon. June and Keegan followed, sensing a moment. Though they did not understand it, they stood by the well. Elias held her hand. He had nothing to give her. No gold, no ring. Tamsin reached into her own pocket and pulled out the heavy, black iron harness ring, the one he had put on her recipe, the one she had clutched in the courtroom. She held it out to him. He looked at the ring, then at her. He understood. He took it from her palm. "It is just iron," he said, his voice thick. "It holds," she replied, echoing his own words back to him. He did not put it on her finger. He held her left hand, and together they slid the heavy, practical, unbeautiful ring onto her fourth finger. It was loose, it was cold, and it was the most precious thing she had ever owned. "I'll stay," he said again. A vow. "I'll stay," she replied. A promise. June, impatient, tugged on Tamsin's skirt. "Are we going to eat now?" The celebration was not planned, but it happened. The community they had accidentally built brought the feast. Clara Boone rode in, not in her deputy's uniform, but in a pressed blue dress, carrying a jug of cider. The rancher's wife, who had watched the children, brought a massive pot of green chili stew that burned all the way down. The men who had helped build the barn brought flatbread and a bushel of roasted corn. Someone brought pickled cucumbers and jam. They laid it all out on the long trestle table Elias had built. It was a loud, happy, chaotic meal. After, Clara, flushed with cider, stood on a bench. I have prepared a verse," she announced, pulling a crumpled paper from her pocket. She proceeded to read a terrible, heartfelt poem about a warrior woman and a steadfast man and a canyon of hope. The rhymes were forced, the meter non-existent. When she finished, there was a moment of stunned silence, and then Elias, of all people, began to clap. The rest of the table erupted in cheers, and Clara bowed, laughing. That night, after everyone had left, after the children were asleep, Elias pulled Tamsin outside onto the porch. The moon was a high, thin sliver, and the stars were a riot of cold fire. He took her hand. "I do not know how," he said. "Me neither," she whispered. He put one hand on her waist, and she put one on his shoulder. And there, on the porch, they danced. It was not a waltz. It was a clumsy, shuffling two-step, their boots scraping on the new pine boards. They were both out of rhythm, bumping into each other. But they held on. Tamsin, laughing, finally gave up and just rested her head on his chest. She closed her eyes, listening. His heart, beneath her ear, was not a frantic, panicked beat. It was a slow, deep, powerful thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of a water wheel. She thought, steady, unchanging, turning and turning, and bringing up life. There was no paper certificate from a judge to make it real. There was only the solid, undeniable proof of persistence. They woke up the next morning, and everyone was still there. The broken parts of their lives were being mended. One day, one post, one decent meal at a time. The table, Tamsin realized, Always had room for one more. That was a bigger vow than any piece of paper. A week later, the supply wagon from Mesilla brought something new. It was a crate, sent by rail from the east. Elias had to use a crowbar to open it. Inside, nestled in clean straw, was a cradle. It was not a rough-spun willow basket. It was made of fine, polished cherry wood, with rockers so perfectly balanced that a single touch set it moving. It was a beautiful, expensive thing. Carved into the hood, in elegant, flowing script, were two words, Haven Fork. Tamsin's hand went to her mouth. There was a note tacked to the side. Elias pulled it free. It was a letter. It spoke of a woman and a child, pulled from a camp in Arizona, identified from Pike's ledger. It spoke of a family in Boston, wealthy and powerful, who had spent 5 years searching for their kidnapped daughter. The note was signed, not by the woman, but by a man. A gift for the place that gave me back my daughter and my grandchild. I can never repay you, but perhaps this can hold another child who was found, signed, a grandfather who now has a name to say. Tamsin was crying, silent, hot tears that dripped onto the polished wood. Elias lifted the cradle. It was heavy. They carried it inside, together. They placed it by the window, where the morning sun would hit it. Keegan, curious, toddled over. She peered inside, then reached up and tentatively tapped her small, fat hand against the smooth, carved wood. The sound was not a sharp crack. It was a low, resonant, musical thump, a sound that was solid and full and round as the future. The winter was hard, but the cabin was tight, and the new stable held. Haven Fork was not just a place. It was a verb. It was the act of mending, of building, of taking in. The journal Tamsin kept was now halfway full, a testament of names reclaimed. The attack, when it came, did not come with the roar of Pike's charge. It came with the stealth of a snake. It was a night in late spring, the moon a pale, watery disk that gave just enough light to make the shadows deeper. Tamsin was asleep, a deep, dreamless sleep she had only known for a few months. Elias was beside her, his breathing a slow, steady rhythm. A sound, it was tiny, a metallic squeak. The hinge on the new stable door, the one that held the women and children who had nowhere else to go. It was a sound Tamsin should not have been able to hear, but she was a mother, and her ears were tuned to the slightest disturbance. She was awake, instantly, not in panic, but in cold, absolute clarity. She slid from the bed. Her bare feet hit the cold floor. She did not wake Elias. She did not need to. The space beside her was already empty. He was gone. Tamsin moved past the cherry-wood cradle, past June's pallet. She took the sawed-off coach gun from the brackets by the door. She checked the load, the heavy brass cartridges sliding home. She eased the cabin door open. The night air was cold, smelling of damp earth and the first promise of rain. The yard was bathed in that pale, sick moonlight. She saw them, 3 figures, moving from the stable. 2 were men she did not know, hired guns. The third, she knew. Ragged, thinner, his tailored suit now a ruined mess, but his face unchanged. Judge Amos Abernathy. He was a fugitive, a man with a federal warrant on his head, and he had come back to the source of his ruin. He was dragging a girl by the arm. Ilara, the woman from the Cobre mines. She was their bargaining chip. Tamsin stepped onto the porch, the shotgun held low, its twin barrels looking like 2 black, hollow eyes in the dark. "Let her go, Amos," Tamsin said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut the night air. Abernathy froze. He spun, shoving the girl. Ilara, in front of him. A gun pressed to her temple. The 2 hired guns fanned out, their own pistols leveling at Tamsin. "The bitch," Abernathy hissed, his voice a dry rattle. You ruined me! My name is mud in this territory!" "Your name is true, for the first time," Tamsin said. She took a half step forward. "Stay back," he shrieked. "I will kill her. I just need a horse. And food. You will give them to me. You owe me." "The papers say you do." "Your papers are ash," Tamsin said, her voice dropping. taking on a cold, hard cadence. The papers burned. There is nothing left but my people. I am the law, he screamed, his voice cracking. My seal, my signature, that is power, that is forever. That is gone. From the high ridge above the draw, a pinprick of light flashed, a tiny glint, as if a star had fallen. It was Clara Boone, with a mirror, catching the moonlight. She had been watching the draw every night. She was signaling Elias. Who was? Tamsin knew, somewhere in the shadows behind the stable. A ghost with a rifle. Abernathy pushed the gun harder against Alara's head. Shoot, damn you, see what happens. We trade. Her life for my passage. Tamsin looked at the man. He was a creature of paper, of abstracts, of profit and loss. He did not see the woman he was holding. He saw a bargaining chip. She lowered the shotgun, resting its butt on her hip. You do not even know her name, do you? Tamsin asked. Abernathy blinked, confused by the change in tactics. What? It does not matter. Her name is Alara, Tamsin said, her voice clear and carrying. A prosecutor's voice. You sold her to the Cobre mine for 2 ounces of silver. Your seal is on the paper, page 46 of your ledger. Abernathy flinched, as if she had struck him. Be quiet. Then there was Sophie. Tamsin continued, her voice rising. A terrible recital. From El Paso, you sold her for $50, and her son, Mateo, aged 4. You listed him as livestock to avoid the transport fee, page 29. The 2 hired guns shifted. This was not the job they had signed up for. They were looking at each other, their guns wavering. Mary, Tamsin said, her voice like a hammer. 15 years old. You sold her to a saloon in Tucson. She was dead in a month. Page 32. Stop it, Abernathy shrieked, his face pale, his eyes wide. He was a man of numbers, of faceless accounts. He could not bear the names. The names were ghosts, and Tamsin was summoning them. They are just numbers. Stop saying their names. You will hear them. Tamsin said, Sarah, Lucia, Annabelle. You took their names, and you turned them into profit. You erased them. Abernathy was trembling. His attention ripped from his hostage, from his defense, focused entirely on Tamsin, on the voice that was bringing his entire filthy history to light. In that moment, as his gaze was locked on Tamsin, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness by the water trough. It was Elias. He moved with a silence that was absolute. He was not a man. He was an inevitability. He took 3 silent steps. He did not go for Abernathy. He went for the man on the right, a hand over the man's mouth, the barrel of his Colt pressed to his temple. The man froze, dropping his gun. The second hired gun, who had been staring at Tamsin, suddenly threw his pistol into the dirt. I ain't part of this, he spat. I was told it was a simple retrieval. I ain't part of this. Abernathy spun, his gun firing wildly, the bullet zinging off the well stones. Ilara screamed and dropped, scrambling away. Elias was on Abernathy. It was not a fight. It was a dismantling. Elias's hand clamped onto Abernathy's wrist, twisting. The snap of bone was loud in the yard. The gun clattered on the stones. Elias kicked it away and slammed the judge face first into the mud. It was over. Abernathy was weeping. High-pitched, pathetic sobs. Clara Boone rode into the yard, her shotgun resting on her lap, 2 marshals behind her. Took you long enough, she said to Elias, who was binding Abernathy's one good hand. Abernathy, his face pressed to the ground, screamed, the sound muffled by the mud. You will all forget me. I was a judge. I had power. You will forget this. Tamsin walked over, the coach gun still in her hand. She looked down at the pathetic, broken man. She had waited for this moment. She had dreamed of revenge, of fire, of shooting him herself. But seeing him now, she felt nothing but a vast, cold emptiness, and then a profound, final closure. We will not forget, she said, her voice quiet, but carrying. We will remember Ilara. We will remember Sophie, and Mateo, and Mary. We will remember every name in that book, so that this never happens again." She knelt, grabbing a fistful of his hair, forcing him to look at her. "But you," she said, her voice the final judgment. "You will have no name here. You will be the man we caught in the dark, the man whose papers burned. You will be no one." She let his head drop back into the mud. She stood up. The whole of Haven Fork was on the porch, drawn by the gunshot, the women, the children. Ilara was being held by one of the others. June stood at the front, her face pale, holding Keegan in her arms, protecting her. The two children were staring at Tamsin. Tamsin was their anchor. She was the wall. Tamsin turned away from the marshals. She looked at Elias. He was standing by the well, his gun holstered, his face streaked with dirt. He was watching her. They did not run to each other. They did not embrace. He just held out his hand. She walked to him, the heavy shotgun in one hand, and placed her free hand in his. His grip was solid, warm. She looked at the cabin, at the open door where light was now spilling out. She looked at the children on the porch. She looked at the man holding her hand. "I choose to stay," she said. The words for him alone. She was not running. She was not hiding. She was home. With you, with all of them. As she spoke, the sky finally broke. The tension that had been building in the air for hours released. A single, cold drop of rain hit the back of her hand. It landed directly on the black iron ring. The water caught the faint moonlight, and for a half-second, the ring, her ring, shone with a pure silver light. The main door of the cabin opened wider, and one of the women stood in the frame, beckoning them in, out of the rain, which was now beginning to fall in earnest, washing the yard clean. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please leave a comment and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give us some extra support by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by even more listeners.